Good evening, friends, and welcome to another lesson in our series of In God We Trust, as Michael Ray and I contend to try to walk through this new study where we look at biblical principles of stewardship and look at biblical principles concerning our money and our possessions. Thank you for those of you who tuned in to lesson one, and we appreciate your feedback for that, and we look forward to getting into lesson two. Michael, how's everything in beautiful Somerset tonight?
Everything is lovely. My understanding is now in delicious podcast form in addition to the regular video. We're just giving the people what they want.
We fooled around and got halfway fancy. And for those of you still holding on out there, I've submitted the podcast to iTunes, and I'm currently waiting on reviews. So hopefully that'll be up in iTunes here shortly, and we'll share that information out, how you can find it in iTunes as well.
I mean, I know it was a long study, but how long is it going to take them to review it?
It depends on who's listening, I guess. How many people are in Cupertino tonight that are working on this? They may have. Hey, listen, I'd say the quarantine has got all kinds of goofy people like you and me deciding they should start a
podcast. Yeah, exactly.
Again, thank you all for being with us. Tonight, we're going to get into really our first lesson of understanding really the concept of stewardship and the concept of ownership. Who owns what, and how should then we react based on that. So we've got some verses we're going to try to look at together tonight to start off as we kind of make our way through this and build a case for who truly has ownership of the goods, of the land, of the possessions. So we'll start here in Exodus chapter 9. In Exodus 9, Moses said to him, "As soon as I've gone out of the city, I lift my hands out of the Lord, the thunder will cease and there will be no more hail, so that you will know the earth is the Lord." So, again, the point here in Exodus 9 is we need to understand who all this stuff belongs to, right? So if the earth and all of that will cease, the weather even belongs to God. Exodus 19:5. "Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine." So again, two things there in Exodus 19 is not only will they be his possession, right? They are God's chosen people, but he's saying the earth is his, so he can move them into wherever he wants. And remember, what is Exodus? It's the Exodus out of Egypt, their trek toward the promised land. And as he's guiding them toward this promised land, they can have confidence because it's his, right? God has the right to give it to them. Michael, you want to take these next couple?
Yeah, so this is a pretty fundamental point that we're talking about, is that the ownership of all things is God's, and that is in a lot of ways that's an elementary level idea. It's got some really profound implications. So a lot of these verses just kind of laying that foundation. The verses, the earth is mine, as we'll read in Psalm 50. All the cattle, all the possessions, everything, it all belongs to God. Psalm 50. Somewhat familiar passage. "Every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills, the birds, all that moves in the field is mine. The world is mine, and the fullness are mine." And mine is that's a word that seeps into our vocabulary really easily. That we begin to hoard all of our possessions and think about them all as mine. That we have ownership. But these verses kind of tell a different story. I've been particularly intrigued in this study in Leviticus 25, and we've talked a little bit about this. So maybe think a moment about this verse. As God was giving the children of Israel the laws there in the desert, this one was in particular interesting as related to the promised land that they were going to be given. He told them that the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. You are strangers and sojourners with me. And I think that's one to talk about, not for the point that we can't have real estate transactions today, but what was God trying to impress upon his people as they were going into the promised land, that and ultimately we know they did. They kind of fell in love with the dirt, right? And they turned it into mine instead of into God's. But God's idea was always that they had a complete understanding that it was God's and they were tenant farmers, and they could have some transactions among themselves for so many years. But in that Jubilee year, and that's what Leviticus 25 is really about, in that Jubilee year, the possession would revert back to its original owner, because that's who God put in place there. And God was the ultimate owner of record, and he was going to put in place who he wanted. So anyway, I think that's a fascinating insight into how God thought about ownership of the Promised Land.
And I don't want to get too in the weeds and background stuff, but for those of you listening along that are not, wholly familiar, or it's been a long time since you've read through your Old Testament and how it worked going to the Promised Land. So, Israel was in Egypt and they were in captivity, right? And I think most will remember about how Moses went up against Pharaoh and there was the 10 plagues and he led them out of Egypt. And as they went to approach the Promised Land, it was a land that flowed with milk and honey. It was a perfect, pristine land there in the midst of the Fertile Crescent. It was perfect for fields, for growing, for having cattle. I mean, it was the pristine land that was there, and God was giving this to them. They were His promised people based on the promises to Abraham. They were going to get this land. Well, it's also, He reminds them along this trek that they will drink from wells they did not dig. They will live in houses that they did not build. That all that's being gifted to them is at God's hand. And that's very important for them to remember as they go into this Promised Land, that God is providing all of this for them. And they have no right to think of possession for themselves, because they're doing this on God's hand alone, but also that they should be appreciative, right? And that's probably problem number one. If I'm going back to the nation of Israel and I'm listing their problems, problem number one is they did not appreciate anything that God did for them, because they quickly would go and, play the whore with other gods. So that they were quickly to get away from that. But I think it's interesting to think about how, as they went into the land, that part of this Levitical law here is that, they were to, it wasn't theirs, even in their barter system, even in their buying and selling, that based on the 12 tribes, right, all the land was partitioned off, that every tribe had land and every family had land. And that's why the genealogies were important and were significant, because that designated what land that you have. And especially in an agricultural based society, land was a livelihood, land was money, land was significant. And if you didn't have any land, then you couldn't prosper, you couldn't live, you couldn't do anything. Some of you may remember the story of Ruth, right? Ruth and Naomi, as they come back to the nation of Israel after they had been off in the, foreign god lands, right? They come back, and it was important that the land of Ruth's husband was redeemed, that she was able to get that, and Boaz redeems that for her, and it becomes part of, the land that they possess all the way down into the lineage of Christ. But knowing those stories, I think, helps us better understand that they didn't do anything to get this land. They didn't deserve the land. They didn't earn the land. This land, by all intents and points, is grace, right, Michael? I mean, it's what them having the land is the epitome of grace.
And I think that speaks to the larger point, that I think what God was trying to get across, and I think the point is the same, even if some of the details in Leviticus, obviously the laws have changed, is that ultimate ownership is God's, and our really complex system of deeds and legal documents is really impressive, but ultimately it's secondary, because ultimate ownership is God's, and when we lose sight of that, we really, as we'll talk about in a little bit as we lead into this part, when we lose sight of that, we completely lose sight of what our responsibility is toward those possessions, because they become ours and not His. If you want to, on that same topic, if you want a really deep cut, you go to the last chapter of the book of Numbers, and the daughters of Zelophehad. They had this issue about, to your point, in an agriculture agrarian society, when a man only had daughters, how is he going to retain his land? And the point there is ultimately the same, is that, hey guys, and Moses kind of comes to this conclusion and gives us the land. Said this land is God's. What transactions we make among ourselves are secondary to the ultimate ownership, and we're going to revert this back to what the ownership that God wants. We're playing Monopoly, or we're playing Risk, or whatever here, but the owner of the game board is going to decide. And so anyway, that all goes to that point that you're making, is that the things that we have are given by the grace of God for our use for whatever period of time that we have it. And I think this idea in Leviticus is even more significant, because when we would use the phrase that God gave the land to the children of Israel, we would use that as a gave, to the intent that was a final signing over of a deed, right? That he handed over full possession of the land, and it was theirs to do with as they choose in perpetuity. And not only this verse, but we know in history that wasn't the case. That and this last verse on our slide here would help with that conclusion, is that this giving was a giving of possession, not a giving of ownership. And I think that's a significant difference, that God does give us possession of things. That doesn't mean that we have ultimate ownership. And he says that here in Jeremiah 25, and you can read those verses, that he says that even Nebuchadnezzar, who, as we know, was a pagan, godless king, as he came into power, he calls him my servant, and I have given him the beasts of the field, and have given him these lands, and all nations shall serve him until the time of his own land comes, and then they'll make him their slave. So all these things, again, God may give possession, but he makes it clear that he never transfers full ownership in the ultimate sense here. He's still going to move the pieces around the game board as he chooses.
Yeah, and maybe the word that we are more familiar with and more comfortable with is lease. We lease these from God. Essentially, that's what the Israelites were doing. They were leasing these lands from God. Now, their lease payments were their, obedience to God. They're following God. Remember, the contract it wasn't financial, it was spiritual. I will be your God if you will be my people. And as long as they were his people, then he continued to give them, they were allowed to stay on the land. But as Jeremiah points out very clearly, when you stopped holding up your end of the bargain, I'm going to take my land and give it to Nebuchadnezzar. And I'm going to take my cattle and give it to Nebuchadnezzar. And by the way, his time is temporary too, because, all the nations shall serve him and his son and his grandson until the time of his own land comes. And then I'm going to give it to somebody else. God was already, 7 steps down the chessboard ahead as he's explaining these things through Jeremiah, that this stuff's already foreordained. But the important part here that I think is so significant is it's God's right to do with it as he pleases.
Yes. And it reminds me, sometimes when one of your children come to you and say, well, I think that I should be able to do this because this is my room. You say, whoa, settle down here, buddy. Let's remember that you possess that room. You do not own it. And as my wife has made clear to my son on occasion, when he has lost the privilege of his room for various and sundry reasons and got exiled to other areas of the house where he had to live for a time, that room that you have by our benevolence. Yeah. So you have possession of that room as long as we got us a little social contract here that we're all going to play by the rules. But the ownership of this house, and first, remember, ultimately is God, but on a more temporal level is me and your mother. And so we still get to make the decisions. And I think that when we act as if, or when the children of Israel act as if they had ultimate ownership of that land to do with whatever they want, that God felt very much the same way. I said, settle down, boys. You are here by my benevolence. And when you don't clean your room, you may be exiled elsewhere.
Correct. Or you sneak somebody in the middle of the night where they shouldn't be.
Listen, I'm not ready for that.
I wasn't pointing that in your house. I meant the false gods that they were sneaking in.
Well, it was too close to home. Let's move on.
So that's not good there. Ezekiel 16. Again, the multiple of these are making the same point, but they're there for emphasis, right? You know, you also took your beautiful jewels of my gold and my silver, which I had given you for yourself, and made for yourselves images of men, and then played the whore. You know, God, when Ezekiel is here, remember as Ezekiel starts, Ezekiel's in Babylonian captivity, right? And as he's talking to the people, you know, as the beginning of Ezekiel starts, they're by the river Kabar there, and they're weeping as they sing the songs of Jerusalem. And Ezekiel, as he's teaching the people, part of the teaching is that, why are you here? Why are we here? You all are crying about missing Jerusalem, but you didn't appreciate it when we had it. And let's talk about what you did. You took the things of God and you crafted these images. You snuck these dirty women in the middle of the night into God's house and you played the whore. You profaned what was God's with God's own stuff. Like that's the ultimate. And I think of that act of betrayal that some couples have gone through, where not only did you commit adultery, but you committed adultery in your house and even in your marriage bed, right? Like it'd be almost impossible to get over that not only did you do this, but you did it in our house that we built together, in our bed where we slept together. So there's that type of level of betrayal of the intimacy because they use the things of God against God. Haggai chapter 2, the silver is mine, the gold is mine, declares the Lord of hosts. Luke chapter 14, this is Jesus, talking about therefore, so if you cannot renounce all that you have, if you can't give it all up, then you can't be my disciple. We talked about that a little bit with the rich young ruler last week. And so that again is this point that we have to not think about the things. Now, Jesus is not telling all of us that we've got to go take a vow of poverty, right? But he's saying if we don't have the ability to see those possessions, those blessings as rubbish, then we can't be. And remember what a disciple is. A disciple is a student, is a learner of Christ. That we can't get to step one. We can't start to learn about Jesus unless we're ready to deny that. And then in Psalm 24,
just a moment on that word renounce. That's a pretty interesting comment that Jesus makes there. That if you don't renounce, if you're not willing to remove or disclaim ownership of these things, then you can't be my disciple. And to your point, I don't think that necessarily means that we have to liquidate them. And he asked the rich young ruler obviously to liquidate and give his money to the poor. But in this case, I'm not sure that we're talking about liquidation and hand them off to some charity. But just in a lot of ways, the renouncing is an understanding that where the ultimate ownership is, that the renouncing is a intellectual assignment that says, hey, to your point, these things are on loan from God, that I am an overseer of these things. And I know you're going to talk more about that concept, but that I'm an overseer of these things for a brief time. And so, we want to think about the extreme of renouncing, give it all away. And perhaps we need to be prepared for that mentally. But I think more practically, this verse just means that we need to intellectually renounce this idea of mine. That intellectually we understand that we are users of things, and God expects return on His investment. And so we'll certainly get to that idea.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point there. That we talked about this. If you were along for the Philippians ride, this idea of missing some of these words, and Michael's exactly right, that the idea of renounce, that's an important word. That's significant of how we view and how we look at things. And it's not just possessions though, right? Part of coming to Jesus, part of coming to God is what we have to also renounce the old man, right? We got to get rid of that man of sin, the man of death, the one that only benefits himself, to be God's, to be with Jesus. That's part of that repentance, and included in that, I believe, is our view toward our possessions as well. Not only is that old man of sin got to go away, but everything that he owns, in a sense.
Yes.
Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein, for he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. So the language here, Psalm 24, is important too. So why is it God's ownership? Michael, why does the land and the rivers and the seas, why does all of that belong to God?
Well, yeah, that's an elementary question, right? I mean, who's the creator? So the creator is the possessor, and so that part certainly makes sense. If you have belief in a divine creation, then you certainly understand the idea of divine ownership.
And that's right. If we believe Genesis 1:1, right? In the beginning, God, and everything that came after that was God's creation speaking into existence, just as if, let's say I'm a competent artist, and we've already disclosed in our last lesson that Michael and I have the accounting side of the brain, both of us. So I'm not painting anything. There's no fear of that. But let's say that I paint a masterpiece, a Picasso, a Rembrandt. I have, just this masterful piece. It's mine, right? I would then either give or sell or loan that to somebody else. And oftentimes with these museums that the real owner, these paintings may be on display at a museum, but they're on loan from somebody. Whoever either the creator or the owner was at the time have loaned them to the museum so that we can get the visual benefit of them. We can go and look at it and admire it, but who the real owner is the creator of that. That's the true ownership. If Rembrandt, if Picasso were alive, all of their paintings are owned by them. And I think we have to understand that in the concept of, if God is the creator, if he made it, it's his. And therefore we should follow the rules that are those guiding principles.
So that leads me to one of my favorite examples of the way that we treat possessions on earth is we treat it. I heard this example one time. It stuck with me because I think it's so poignant. As we're in a museum and we're walking around with some of the art, and we're just walking around the museum holding the art. And somebody says, "Well, is that your art? Do you own that?" "No, I don't own this. I'm just walking around with it." "Well, why do you walk around with this art?" "So, well, I like the way that people treat me when I hold this art." "So, well, what do you got to do when you got to leave?" I'm not thinking about leaving. I don't care about leaving. I just like the way that people treat me when I walk around with this art. And that's the way we are at times of life with God's possessions. We like the way that people treat us because we have some of God's possessions. And we don't really think about or care about what we got to do when we got to leave the earth. We don't think about what we got to do when we got to leave the museum. We just kind of like the way that people treat us when we're holding the art. And it's no more ours than the guy these possessions are no more ours than the guy that's holding the art and walking around the museum. But we just like the way it feels to have it and the way that people treat us, and don't give a moment's thought to who really owns it or what's going to happen when we have to put it back. And so anyway, I think that's an example that has stuck with me.
No, yeah, I think that's a powerful story. And the only, piece I'd add to that is, we also like how it makes us feel, right? We like
sure.
how others view it, but when I'm holding this, I feel good, I feel safe, I feel whatever. But at the end of the day, to your point, there's a point when the museum closes, right? You got to set that down. And maybe the guy next to you, maybe your kids, maybe your family pick it up and carry it around for a while, but you don't. You got to set that thing back down, and it's time to go home, which is strong here. So walk us through 1 Corinthians. What's the Apostle Paul writing here to the church at Corinth?
Yeah, so we're in, those are familiar with 1 Corinthians 10. We're in this kind of conversation about Paul trying to help the Corinthians through how they should treat or how they should view meat that's been sacrificed to idols and it might be sold in the marketplace. And we could spend a whole lesson on that. And you can go down a pretty lengthy conversation about that. But in context here, in verse 25, he's telling these brethren, eat what's sold in the marketplace without raising any questions. So don't bother your conscience with those issues, because verse 26, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. This food that you buy in the marketplace is God's. He didn't transfer possession of that food to this idol. The idol, the idol is just as you are. was just a possessor of this thing for a limited time, whatever it was. If it was meat in the marketplace or it was money, whatever, the idol was a possessor of that. The idol did not have ownership of that. This is God's stuff. And so wherever it came from, this is God's stuff, and it can be eaten with thanksgiving. And so I think that it gives us some insight into how God views this possession, is that whoever held it in the interim, whatever, it's God's. And so this, we only use this idea not to talk about the idea of, whether idol worship or sacrifice, not to set that all to aside for a minute, and just to say that the ultimate point is these Corinthians could eat this with thanksgiving because it's God's. That the ownership of this was never transferred anywhere else. Ultimately, whoever owned the cow or owned the meat or slaughtered the animal, it's God's. The stuff is God's, and so if we get it in a lawful way, we can eat it with thanksgiving.
Right, and that's again the key to everything we're talking about here, right? Is that the ownership is always God's, and what someone else does with a possession doesn't negate the fact that it still belongs to God, right? Because somebody else does something foolish with it. I don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole, but, let's say that, a drunk drives a car and, runs people over with it, right? And I buy that car at auction. Like, is that car now tainted because the drunk used it for that purpose? No, like the car, ultimately, the vehicle itself now is under my possession, but in a bigger picture, it's God's. And as long as I use it for good and don't use it for evil, it's to benefit me. So, we can't always go back to the owner. Well, oh, this person used it for bad, so therefore it's cursed. Like, we got a cursed vehicle or a cursed, knife or a cursed whatever. It's foolishness. All things belong to God and can be used lawfully to glorify God. And I think that's the other point that's we often miss here, is that eat it with thanksgiving to God. Use whatever possessions come into your hand to glorify God, even if somebody else intended them for bad, right? Even if somebody else sacrificed this animal to please a piece of wood or a stick or something that's not real, you can take that and use it to glorify God in a good way.
I think there's some real interesting possible implications there. And I'd be curious to get your take on this as I just think through this, and we haven't really talked about this, but I think there's implications on this for a business person. If you're engaged in a lawful transaction, does the business person are they expected to do a background check on everybody that comes into their establishment, right? Well, I don't know where that money came from, or I don't know. Again, not that we're going to do anything illicit or illegal intentionally, certainly, but again, if the transaction is legal and the blessing is from God, Paul would tell the Corinthians, like, you don't have to do a background check to make sure that person's not an idol worshiper that got that money that came in and bought bread at your store, right? That the blessing is still from God in that regard. And so I do think there's some interesting implications of that if we understand that the stuff is God's, and whoever held it, the stuff is God's. I just think that's an interesting perspective as it relates to modern business.
Right. And I think that's the other idea, that because it belongs to God, it can at any time be redeemed, right? Even if it was on the bad path, so again, I don't want to get too far down this, but I do think it's important here. But let's say that, a $20 bill that came out of the U.S. Mint, a brand new $20 bill, that $20 bill gets paid out to Bob for working lawfully at the factory. Well, Bob takes that $20 and gives it to the local drug dealer for drugs, right? So now it's gone from a good intent purpose, and that $20 bill now goes to the drug dealer. Well, the drug dealer then comes into your store and buys a loaf of bread or a cake. Like, is the 20 cursed? Like, can we not accept the 20 because we know that if we run it back, it somehow got astray? Or now that it's back into a lawful stream of business, I can take that same $20 bill and put it in the collection plate on Sunday? Or is that thing tarnished because Bob bought drugs with it? if we think about how our currency cycles, the money that's in your wallet right now, assuming anybody's carrying paper money these days, right? But the money, the dollar bills that are in your wallet could have been a million different places before it got to you, and could be a million different more before it makes it into the treasury or into the hands of an evangelist that's spreading the gospel in another country, right? Those things can be anywhere, and at any time, any of those possessions, any of those dollars, any of those things can be redeemed and used for good again, even if they were an evil purpose at one point.
Yeah, and Paul's point here, without raising questions, if we received it in a lawful transaction and ultimately we realize it's God's, use it to God's glory. Again, I think there are so many meaningful real life business applications in some of these, or financial implications in some of these verses, that if you spend a little time and meditate on.
Right. And I think that's the concept here, though, that, if we haven't been plain enough so far, as we kind of move to the next point, is everything under the sun belongs to God. It's his. We may be users of it. We may be lessers of it. We may be in possession of it from time to time, but the ownership never leaves God. God is still always the owner and in control. So that brings up then this idea. If all things belong to God, and ultimately, if they're his, and I am the servant working on the farm or working in the vineyard or whatever, and I am using these possessions that ultimately belong to my master, how's that work? And there's a financial term for this, and I'll let the CPA lead us through the financial terminology here.
I think you're a legal fiduciary. I'm just a mere bean counter, so I should probably allow you to walk through this. But if perhaps those that are listening are familiar with this concept that they're a fiduciary or they're a trustee. That idea, somebody that has the power over property, and you can see the definition there, but that it belongs to somebody else. So again, we're not the legal owner, but we have some power over the property. We've been given some limited authority over some property for a period of time. And very often you see this idea if someone has some money that they're trying to set aside for a minor, right? That it's somebody has control over that property for the benefit of the minor until they're of age, right? And so again, you never own it, and the things that you actually do with the money is not for your benefit; it's for somebody else's. But for a limited period of time, you do have power over that property, those assets, that cash or whatever it is. You got power over it, as long as you stay within the bounds of whatever authority you've been given.
So what is that basic tenet? The other words we use are power of attorney, trustee, executor, administrator. But Michael, when we talk about a fiduciary, what is the singular oath or whatever that you must abide by if you are entrusted with another's possessions?
Yeah. So, I mean, and that's the kind of the heart of fiduciary, right? Is that it's always for the benefit of the owner. So that's and I hope that's what you wanted me to end up at. And I think that that is the key intent of that idea, that it's for the benefit of the owner. And so in a lot of these complex financial shenanigans that you're in, right, that you have to sign off on being a fiduciary for somebody else, in meaning that you are not going to do anything to your own benefit, right? That everything is done with the sole focus of the benefit of the owner, because it's their assets. And again, the fiduciary, the trustee, may have some limited power for a limited time, but ultimately the benefit is expected, is legally obligated to be for the benefit of the owner.
Yeah, that's so we've often heard about the Hippocratic Oath, right? that all doctors take, that you do no harm. That's the doctor's number one. If you're a medical doctor, your oath is initially to do no harm. Well, a fiduciary's oath is to benefit whoever you have these powers for. So if I'm, Michael used the example of for the minor. So, if I'm taking care of a minor, and let's say this minor's parents have passed away and they've been left some property, some money to be able to fulfill these wishes of what they want. Well, if I'm responsible for the property, for the money, it has to be based on the owner's wishes and their benefits, right? I can't take that property and do whatever I want to do with it. I can't say, well, hey, I really like to have a pool out back, so I'm going to spend this money and create a pool. It has to be to the benefit of the owner or the beneficiary, right? In some of these cases, that the owner is setting this up for a beneficiary, but that's who has to have the benefit of it. So when we are acting in a fiduciary capacity, and I'm trying to bring us around to, if all the possessions are God's, if I'm God's fiduciary, if I'm God's power of attorney, then how I act with these possessions must benefit God. Now, I can receive a secondary benefit. So in all of these fiduciary arrangements, there is usually compensation for whoever the trustee is. They get, if you're taking care of the car for somebody, you can drive that car. But ultimately, you're taking care of that for the owner. And you're to take care of it, keep the oil changed and car cleaned. And whenever the owner wants it or needs you to run an errand for them, you use that to accomplish that goal. So when we think about that, and if all my possessions really aren't mine, it's God's, and I'm just using God's possessions, how then should that change my worldview and my outlook? If this is really God's car that I'm driving, if this is really God's house that I'm living in, if this is really God's money that's in my checking and savings account, or even my 401k, how does that change how I make decisions?
Yeah, so I think it fundamentally changes it. And it's, again, this very simple concept that God owns everything turns into this really, really profound idea that what is the return on God's investment? And I hope, I don't mean to take you beyond where we wanted to go tonight, but at least that's where it takes me, is that, if we have assets, and I'll just use you as an example because you do have a fiduciary role here. If I have assets and I want to invest them with you, and we set up an account for me, and you're the fiduciary of that account, and you manage that money for me, I have an expectation that there's going to be return, right? That is your responsibility. I have an expectation that there's going to be a return on those assets. If we step back and put this in God's perspective, God has, again, because it all belongs to him, whoever owned it before, whatever happened, these things have been granted to us for a time. And God has an expectation of return on his assets. I think that is both a tremendous, first of all, tremendous feeling of gratitude, because it's all God's, and he has entrusted us with this. He's entrusted us with this fiduciary responsibility with his stuff. And for those of us who've been blessed with some possessions, that to grasp the concept of the trust that God has put in us, that should have some real gratitude. But secondly, we should have some real responsibility. It's a little bit of a daunting thought that God expects return on our use of this asset. And clearly we're not talking about some kind of financial, how many basis points of return are we talking about on this investment? If God is going to have return on his investment, he's going to have spiritual return, right? We're going to have kingdom return on his investment. And that should make us reconsider what we're doing with all of our possessions. What is God's return? And how is God benefiting from the fact that I have been given this vehicle? How is God benefiting from the fact that I've been given this house? How is God benefiting from the fact that I have a retirement plan? And if the answer is that he's not, then we got some serious soul searching to do about what is our stewardship of his asset.
Right. And I think that's the accounting, right, that comes. So in this fiduciary relationship, and as Michael said, that this is part of what I do for a living. So in this fiduciary relationship, there's two very important points that I think have spiritual application. There's one, the initial contract of engagement, right? Where you set up those bounds. And that is when we become a Christian, when we become a child of God, that, remember what we read just a little bit ago in Luke, we're renouncing those possessions. I don't own anything. I am yours. God, I am all yours all the time for the benefit of the kingdom. That's how this relationship is established, right? When I become yours, then everything I am, even though you owned it before, I never acknowledged that, right? My coming to you is an acknowledgement that I am yours and everything that I have is yours, was yours before we got here. So that's important, is that in our initial engagement with God, we are pledging ourselves, our heart, soul, body, mind, everything we touch belongs to God. So that first is important. Secondly, is that someday there will be a final accounting, right? Just like, currently with what I do, there is a quarterly statement that we send out where you look and say, all right, Mike, here's the bounds of our engagement. Here's how many basis points return we've had for this quarter on a risk-adjusted basis. Here's what it means. There will be an accounting from God on Judgment Day where he says, Mike, I gave you these things. I put these into your life. These are my possessions that I let you use.
Trusted you with. Yeah. I just think that is such a profound thought. And that I think it's like a lot of other things. God doesn't spell out for us precisely what the expectation is. It's not quantifiable, but we know there's an expectation, and that God has in his wisdom and his judgment, he knows what that expectation is. And based on all of us, based on the things that we've been given, that expectation is different, but God knows what it is. And that accounting, and no question, we're believers in grace, and we know that grace can make up some deficiencies that I have, but at the same time, there's going to be an accounting. There is an expectation of return, and there's going to be an accounting.
So this is a great opportunity for me to use a nerd word. So in grace, so while we absolutely believe in grace and I want to make sure that's very clear, there's also a standard deviation that we have to be within, right? When this accounting comes, that's where grace comes in, is, how many standard deviations we are to be away. But God has some expectations, right? And we've got to be within those expectations. And it's not perfect, right? We're not, God may say, look, Mike, I expected a return of, 800 spiritual basis points, and you came in at 750, but that's okay. You're within the standard deviation allotted here. But it's not okay that I expected a, spiritual return 800 basis points and you went and put my assets in the sand, right?
Yeah. And that's exactly where probably the next lesson needs to go, is to the parable of the talents, because that hits on exactly this point that we're talking about, is that God had an expectation of spiritual return, and there was an accounting. And we'll talk about this more when we get to this, and this is kind of be a preview, I think, of our next conversation. But what was the anger that was directed at the one talent servant? Was it about his performance, or was it about his lack of effort, or his attitude? And so obviously both are related in that accounting, but I think that leads to a very interesting conversation. That is the parable about the accounting that you are describing.
And that's, again, I don't want to get ahead of us. That's our next class, and we're going to talk more in depth about that, and hopefully be able to shine the light from these concepts we're introducing tonight to put them in place in the parable of talents. And there's a couple other parables we'll look at next week too. But it's this idea of, you were entrusted. God has given these things into our hands, and what did you do with it? Right? That's the, if you leave with nothing else tonight from this class, that's what I want you to think about. That's what I want you to meditate on. That's what I want you to pray about, is what am I doing with God's possessions? If we can get there, then it's worth your cost of the class, right? If we can just get you to that point where you think about, what am I doing with God's possessions? Am I getting the spiritual return that I should? And have I even considered what that spiritual return should be? If we can get you down that path of asking those questions, then we've done our job here. Hopefully from there, we're going to look at some deeper points of this. But this I think is life changing. It was to me when I came across this concept several years ago, when, as we've told you, Michael and I have taught this class, separately. He taught it at Southside. I've taught it in some meetings. But this was very changing to me when I started thinking about the fact that I'm acting on behalf of somebody else.
Well, I'll tell you how dumb and human I am, is that this is life changing to me every time I remember it. So that may be more accurate, is that I wish that it was a more permanent and change, but I think incrementally perhaps I'm getting better. But every time you think about this, I'm reminded that I'm not doing as well as I should. That with every possession comes responsibility, and I wouldn't, we're talking about things that maybe we can put on a balance sheet here about financial possessions, but also remember that there are non-financial things that we are given stewardship of, that God's expects a return on also. That those who have been blessed with a wife, or have been blessed with children, or have been blessed with a church family, or there are younger people in our church family. Those are all blessings that God has put in front of us, that he has blessed us with, that we maybe have in our lives for a short period, that God expects a return from giving us those assets, right? The assets of good elders, the assets of having children in our lives, the assets of having friends who are willing to drag you into a Bible study that maybe you're not qualified for. That all of those things are assets that God puts in front of us, that he, hey Michael, I did give you the benefit of great elders and great Christian friends in a great congregation. And what was my spiritual return from putting you in that place? I think that is I think this concept goes beyond just the things that you can assign a dollar value to.
Right. And I'll take you a little bit further. What about influence? What about, skills and ability? If you're, above average intelligence, and, it's done well to get a bunch of letters after your name, what are you doing with that in the kingdom? What are you doing with that to help? I mean, I think about Joseph, right? I mean, think about Joseph's sphere of influence. Here's somebody, from being, beloved and put up on a pedestal by mom and dad, to thrown into a pit and carried off into slavery. And, at Potiphar's house, he does what he does. Everything that he touches, God blesses, right? So he kept doing more. He could have just done very little and let God bless that, but the more influence he exerted, and then as he goes into prison, the whole deal with Potiphar's wife, and he runs from that. Potiphar, instead of murdering him, puts him into prison. Well, what does he do? His influence on the jailer and his influence on those around him, and he's put in charge of things again. At any point in time, this blessing, this huge monumental blessing that God gave Joseph of influence and influence over others, and being able to both pick them up and challenge them and help them along the way. I mean, we're not talking about money. I mean, we're talking about, intellectual property here, right?
Charisma, whatever he had.
Right. I mean, he's lovable. I mean, everybody likes this guy, and very intelligent, right? Because all the business deals he does turns out well. And then he got interpreting the dreams, and, one of the, funnier, ironic, I don't know how I want to say it, passages in all of Scripture is, the folks from Pharaoh's house, the baker and the cupbearer come in, and you're in prison, and Joseph's like, so why the long face? We're in jail, man. What do you mean why the long face? Like, why are we upset? We're all in jail. But he had that. I mean, that was the environment that he created in the prison, is that nobody should come in sad. Like, that's just, that doesn't make sense. It's a prison. Everybody's supposed to be sad, right? But that influence. So that's the other thing. So let's leave you with this tonight as we close. Before our next class, for those of you that are tuning in from week to week on these, before our next class, I want you to take inventory. I want you to take inventory, not just your balance sheet of, we got X dollars of cash and X hard assets and Y dollars of debt. That's important. Get your head around that. But I want you to take spiritual inventory too. What am I really good at? Am I good at influence? Am I good at helping others? Do I have, fairly good intellect? Have I been good at school? Like, what are the things that come naturally and easy to me that's part of a blessing that is absolutely God-given? And some of us have developed that better, but, I'm pretty sure Michael wasn't a dumb baby, right? He's been above average intelligence his whole life. I'm sure his mama will comment on here and say that. Somebody should. But, those things that we've gotten better at, I want you to take stock of that. And then as we talk about next week, Lord willing, this parable of the talents, let's plug those things in there. Let's start to build what can I do with the information that we're taking in? Because that's the number one point of this class particularly, is we want to give you actionable things to do. So come prepared next week with a list of, with an idea of, with thoughts behind, not only what is my hard asset, what I can put on a balance sheet, but what's my spiritual, intellectual capital? What's that? And how am I using that currently?
Yeah. And I think as the last point for me is that, why are we doing this study, right? And I think the answer is because I think that you and I should feel a responsibility that, given the place that God has put us, how can we use that to help the brethren? There are plenty of places where I am inferior, and I hope that a brother who's superior in that level of whether it is generosity, or whether it is being a better Bible student, or whether it's being a better prayer, whatever those things are, that somebody who's better or has more experience at that, or that's their strong suit, can help me with that. If we have capacity at this, we've got responsibility, and that was kind of the genesis of this thing, right? Is that, not that I'm the world's greatest CPA, or you're the world's greatest financial advisor. No offense, but that if we've got some capacity at this, we've got some responsibility at this. And if everybody in the kingdom has that mindset, I think that we're all more likely to achieve kingdom goals together.
Yeah, there's a formula. I hate when we do this to you all, but there's a formula I always think about it. A plus O equals R. Ability plus opportunity equals responsibility, right? And, hopefully, if you're still in with us, we've demonstrated a little competency here, and you've followed along. At least you've listened to a couple of these. But this is what we found as our opportunity. As we kind of said in the introduction, we've been thinking about how we can do this for a while, and haven't gotten invited anywhere to do this in a gospel meeting. So we found these free mediums online to blast out to the masses, and here we are. So hopefully, this is good for you, and you're getting part of this. But we feel like if there's a way we can help out along the way, then that's what we're here to do. And use some of that intellectual capital. It's helped us both career-wise for sure. But where's the return in the kingdom? And those are some things we're going to help out. And this forum and this format gives us the opportunity to talk about some things maybe that aren't appropriate in a Bible class, because we're going to get to some brass tacks on some stuff, but are absolutely appropriate if we're just having a conversation over the wide, wonderful web, right? So thank you all for tuning in. Again, like and share and comment, anything we can do to help. And we'll come prepared next week to talk more about the parable of talents. So if you'll read that maybe ahead of time, get your homework together. We'll spend some time looking at this day of accounting and what it means when God places things into our hands. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for tuning in.